Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of A Guide to B2B Podcasting. And today's topic is, so you want to launch a podcast? Well, here's what you need to know. And today I am joined by one of our senior producers, Joshua Lorimer. Josh, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here, man. I've listened to almost all of these, so I'm excited to be on one.
Yeah, it should be great. And so today we really wanted to kind of dispel a lot of the myths and how people are thinking and try to kind of break down some mental barriers that we think happen as we have launched. We've launched probably 60 plus podcasts at this point, and wanting to kind of walk through some of the issues we see companies and people hit when going with this and getting started and actually moving toward launch. And so I guess to kind of kick us off, Josh, what are some of the things that you're seeing kind of tripping people up as they start trying to launch a new podcast?
It's kind of the usual suspects, more or less. Someone's getting stuck up with the name of their podcast, which feels like the tricky thing with all of these is they feel like super big deals. The name, the artwork, a lot of the, I think we might consider window dressings of the podcast, which ultimately aren't the substantive things that affect how your podcast does. But for a lot of us outside of the podcast world, they feel like really important pieces. You know, having a name that is exciting or that captivates an audience, having a graphic that catches attention, can be really overwhelming. And there's also this sense that you have to have a very refined, finished product out the gate. But something we were talking about is this is a very living content that it's not like television, it's not like commercials, commercial work on like TV or radio. It's when it's out there, that's it. The commercial is the commercial. If you did an ad for like pre-movie theater stuff, which I used to do, and there was a word misspelled, every time you're in the theater, you're going to see that word misspelled. It's not that. This is something we can refine, we can adjust even after it's launched, even after it's published. So there's really nothing that we can't continue to work on. So it's not these are things not worth bottlenecking and stalling the content itself, which is the value, which is the substance.
Yeah, I love that. I think the key message out of this is there is a million details that we're going to be kind of having to finalize and decide on when launching a podcast. And I think you hit the key thing. It's not TV content. It's not a radio commercial. It's more like putting a blog post up there.
Yes.
You can change that artwork. You can change the audio file. You can swap all of that out. Beyond like what you then put up on social media, that stuff that you really can't change, but like everything else is pretty much can be adjusted after the fact, or you can kind of launch and iterate on it. And that ability to change things, I think, is something that's just really powerful. And I think a lot of people don't realize about the medium.
Oh, it's one of I think the biggest strengths of the social media content and like podcasting.
Yeah. And some of the other things I see as well is like, I think people are thinking that there's a lot of decisions you have to make when launching a podcast. We see people kind of thinking too much about promotion. They're like, they haven't even like got their first interview scheduled and they're down there thinking about how they're going to promote this, which is still months away because they don't even have a first interview scheduled or, we've seen people like holding like 3 prep calls for their first interview. And like, it's like at some point you just got to hop on and do the interview. There's these, or over scripting. We've seen people just show up to their first episodes with like a just overly prepared script, which doesn't sound good as much as like a bullet point or something like that would. So I think those are some of the other things, but it's just kind of this over preparation as opposed to just like diving in and getting it shipped. So,
well, it's almost, you almost kind of psych yourself out by over preparing. You're getting in your head so heavy. It's like overstudying for a test. You're spending so much time thinking about the thing you want to excel at that you're not sleeping, you're not eating. You end up shooting yourself in the foot. So yeah, like the best thing you can do is like you mentioned, like get out of your head, put down minimal amount of directions and let yourself just be a human being on the recording. I think that's always going to serve you way better than a script. And again, we can edit stuff. So if you do say something that you feel makes you look a fool, we can remove it. And like, that's totally fine. So really, it's so much better to get that authentic presentation than a perfectly manicured presence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think another big key thing to hit on this is, it's just like at the end of the day, it's like get going, get rough and dirty. Everyone's going to be better on their fourth or fifth podcast interview, but at some point you just have to ship
Yes.
it. And you can just optimize and you can iterate. Like there's so many things. We do quarterly strategy audits for all of our customers. And we're looking at, hey, here's some other things we can do to optimize. Here's new promotion tactics we can try. Like the bag of promotion tactics we have for a podcast, it's probably like 20 to 25 different tactics that we can use. And it's just like, it's overwhelming to think about it all out of the gate. And so that's why we just like hold that back until we're launched. And then we're like, hey, here's all these things we can now do. We've done the basics. We've shared it on social. We've hit your newsletters, but it's like you can just consistently get better. But I think if people try to do everything right out of the gate, it's honestly overwhelming for most. Like the only companies I've seen that do this well are like very large Fortune 500s where they have like 4 people dedicated to this that are tackling like PR and like it's, and that's rare. Most Fortune 500s, we end up having like 1 or 2 people from their team and like they still have to pace out all the pieces of it.
Like the funny piece of that is that like each example, like the company that like only has like 1 person and they don't have a bunch of like, they're not putting a bunch of resources towards the podcast, and then the company that's just as big but has put a ton of extra resources toward the podcast. Both companies care as much about the final product, but like one is giving themselves like is actually like supporting the product with the level that they feel it deserves. The other is like I think trying to get something that they're going to love a whole lot with as minimal investment. And I think when you're talking about actually working with us, like working with Content Allies, it shifts my mind because I'm almost thinking generically if you're doing a podcast, but if you're working with us, then literally like the best thing you could possibly do is think about the most important piece of the podcast, which is the substance, which is what are you talking about? What's your strategic goal with the type of guests you're getting? What kind of content does your audience want to hear? Are going to benefit from you engaging on? And that's it. You just get that window and like nail that, and we can do everything else to a degree that's going to be way simpler and I think more effective.
Yeah, that's such a great way to put it.
Is that like the least like insulting way I can say that? Because I really don't want to sound like people
like really,
can't do those things.
Yeah, it's like at the end of the day, it's like what matters is you have a good podcast conversation and content. And it's like, yeah, there's all these other decisions that people will judge it by how it looks in the name. And it's like all these things are important, but it's like at the end of the day, that conversation, that content is what matters. And I think people get lost up in all the other details and forget to just create good core content at the core.
Yeah. And like worst case scenario, like we just walk this through real quick. Worst case scenario is you have a graphic you're not super happy with, a name that doesn't resonate with you, but your content kills like in a good way. And you have a ton of success. So like that worst case scenario is you have a super successful podcast with a name that you're like, you've got to be okay with now because it's what people know it for. But like that's, and even then we can change it. Like even then you could change it. Yeah. So like there really is no like this isn't a stone statue.
Yeah. It's like literally you can change all the artwork, you can go swap out all the audio files, like all of that can be changed. So don't let it block you. The next thing I want to hit as we're wrapping up here, I'm just going to walk through like what is essential for launch. So we're talking about like, don't let all this hold you up. Yeah. So like what is essential? So first thing I'm going to say is like, what is your objective? You need to know like, are you out here to create thought leadership content and like educational content and brand awareness in your industry? Or the other objective is, account-based marketing. You want to network with target customers. You want to build, interview people that would be your ideal business partners or customers. Those are kind of the 2 buckets. Shows definitely can hit both categories, but those are the 2 buckets. So deciding what are you trying to achieve. Second on that is who's going to host it. This is surprisingly a question that is not always simple. But making sure, is the CEO hosting it? Is the head of marketing, head of sales, like who is hosting this? Getting clear on that.
Yep.
Then deciding on a name, which is really derived from the objective. We actually have a whole nother episode I recommend you listening to on deciding on a podcast name. We walk through the various objectives and how you would choose a name that would fit aligned with which different objectives. Then from once you have a name, it's like create the podcast artwork, make what it's going to look like, get aligned, make sure that hits brand standards. That's always a blocker. is getting artwork through brand departments. If you're at a company big enough to have a branding department, this is the bane of many podcast launches. But it's not terrible. It's just, just got to have the foresight to decide on the name quickly, get it out to the branding team fast, because it almost always gets hung up for a couple weeks in branding. Other thing is just like, what's your short little description about the podcast going to be? This is typically, what's the intro? How are you going to talk about what the show is, and what are you going to put in those directories when someone reads the description of the show? So that's pretty simple. Again, these are all things that we do, but they are decisions to make. And then like that's all like the stuff that, again, can just be changed. So it's like, just ship it, get it out there, make it okay. And do the best you can, but like, don't bottleneck on that. And then this is the important stuff. You need to plan questions for your first interview. So you need to get that interview scheduled, and then record that first episode. And it's crazy. This is where like those first like handful of things I talked about, the name, the artwork, people will just like spin on that. And then we have to be like, hey, you need to schedule someone to like talk to. And they're like, oh, God. And it's like, they just will get so caught up in the brand that it's like, at the end of the day, if like you don't interview people, we have this brand for no content.
Well, it's like we want to make a pastry shop, but we don't have any chefs yet, and we don't really know how to sell pastry. We've just been sitting here with this lot thinking about a name.
Yeah, that's
it sounds ridiculous when you put it like that, and really it is that ridiculous, but it's hard to see it. I think especially because podcasting is still somewhat nuanced. Regardless of how successful it is, people making podcasts is still a pretty small group. And so it can take a minute for us to wrap our heads around everything.
Yeah. And I think that's just the thing where people will like, I see this with enterprise. This typically is really hard with like enterprise. There's anytime you have a group of people, like everyone debates on all those early things and no one's moving forward interviews. And like we have a whole guest scheduling department, but the thing that like if we're launching a brand new show, we need our customers to bring friendlies in. We need them to schedule people they know, because if we reach out to try to schedule people onto a show that has no content, doesn't even have like anything live yet, like we're not going to get anything. So like we typically are providing guests like 4, 5, 6 and beyond, but our customers have to bring in like friendlies to kind of do those first interviews.
Some social proof.
And this is where people just get hung up, and it's like, move that forward. And like, whenever we see people just bottleneck on this and get caught up on all this stuff, it's like, you just spent 2 months talking about a name. And like, and then when it comes down to the grain of like actually getting people on the calls, and like the other thing that people don't realize about getting friendlies or getting people is like, it is not uncommon to ask someone to do a podcast interview and you get on their calendar for 2 to 3 months out.
Right.
Because like,
especially if you're talking to C-suite individuals.
Yeah. And like, because people want to come out of the gate swinging with big guests, and they'll pull those connections, but it's like, oh, cool. That's scheduled for 2 to 3 months away. And it's like, that's why you have to get moving on getting those guests on the calendar, and then coming up with, a few questions for them, typically 4 to 5 questions, and then just recording the episode.
Okay. Can I ask for one thing? This is not like planned at all, but I feel like it would be super valuable, and it might be a good strong thing to end on is, let's imagine, Jake, that there's a member of a big enterprise team that's like been charged with making a podcast. They found this video, they're listening to it, and they know that these are going to be issues for like their person they're reporting to, like the decision maker above them. If you could hand that person like, here's some language, or send them this clip of me talking, it's like some kind of tool, like what would that be?
I would say start moving interviews forward while you figure out the rest. It's like, start recording episodes, because you can change the intro and outro. Like in your interview, you don't have to say the name of the podcast. You don't have to describe the podcast. Like, as long as you at least have your objective and your host figured out, like you just can then start recording episodes. But like, that's the most important thing. It's like recording content is like, and like, don't get hung up on the other stuff. Record content, and you can move all of those other things in parallel. But recording content takes time. It's hard to get on people's calendars. So get those scheduled. And like, the biggest thing I always tell people is like, it's like, don't worry. Like, don't worry. You don't have the questions. You don't know the topics. Like, just get them on the calendar. And
That's
then like
great.
You have a date to figure everything else out for that interview, and you'll figure it out because you have it on the calendar. So just get the interviews on the calendar. That is going to be what's going to move your show forward to launching. Is, you're going to want a few episodes live. So just get those scheduled. Everything else will fall into place, because once you have those interviews done, you're like, hey, well, if this interview's done, we can launch by this date. And then suddenly everyone's like, we have a deadline for a name. Versus we have had customers, no joke, spend 4 months deciding a name. They sent it to a naming committee. You were there for this, Josh. They sent it to a naming committee and had the entire marketing team of like 30 people vote on names, which was then overruled by the CEO for a different name. And so like these things happen.
Yes.
And so it's just like, get your episodes there, because like once you're sitting on content, people are going to launch. They're going to be like, well, we did it. Because like once you do interviews, it's like, you don't want to sit on those interviews.
And the content will define itself. Like those interviews will also inform you about what are we doing? And it's like, you'll have such a better sense of what you're working with. It'll be so much easier to finalize a name, do all that stuff once you're listening to what you're making.
Yeah. So that is it. Just record the content. And then once you have those done, we do all this. We create social media content. You announce it. You push it out there. You push out a few posts. There's a handful of best practices. We'll do other episodes on launches. But like the big thing is just don't get caught up in all the details. Record some episodes. That is what matters. That is what moves things forward. And once you just get a few of those recordings, set a date that you're going to launch it, and everything else will fall into place. And if you want to change it afterward, you still can. So that is...
And we will be so true to the name of the agency. We will be allies for you in the content. Like we will get your back at every step and even help explain the value of each of these pieces, like along the way.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that is our episode for today. The big thing is don't get caught up in the details. Record some interviews. Everything else will fall into place. Launch it. You can change it. Do your best, but just get it out there and don't let all the million decisions bottleneck you from getting it live. So, Josh, thanks for joining us today.
That was my pleasure.